Okay, welcome to chapter 12. I know last time I said chapter 12 was psychological disorders, but I think I was having a psychologically disordered moment there because chapter 12 is personality, not psychological disorders. Sorry for the excitement that will come. I think that's chapter 14. So we're going to do personality, chapter 12 for this week. And by the way, welcome back from spring break. I hope you had a relaxing time, probably holed up in your house like the rest of us. So we're going to do personality this week. Next week, we're doing social psychology. The following week, we will do personality. I'm sorry. Look, see, it's an issue. The following week, we'll do psychological disorders, not personality. We're doing personality this week. And then the week after that, the last week, we will do therapy. All right. Personality, social psychology, psychological disorders, and therapy. And then you'll be done. Awesome. All right. Next thing to remind you, you have a test this weekend. You have a test this weekend, so do not forget, take that test in addition to the activity and the quiz on the lecture. Okay, so you've got this lecture to listen to, you have a quiz to take, you have an activity, and then you have the exam on this chapter 12, chapter 11, and chapter 10. I think you already covered chapter 9. If you didn't, then that's also on the exam. I will double check and let you know. When you look at the exam, you will see. It will say chapters 9 through 12, probably, or 10 through 12. I think it's actually 9 through 12. I'm going to stop talking now. Just kidding. I'm going to keep talking, and we're going to just do our lecture because I'm trying to remember things that I'm not remembering. All right, personality, chapter 12. What do you know about my personality based on the last 5 minutes? You can just laugh to yourselves. Yeah, that's hilarious. All right. So, what creates your personality? Does it come with you? Is it inborn? Is it shaped by your environment? Have you ever heard blank slate? This idea of blank slate was this idea that people used to have. Almost nobody has this idea anymore. If they have this idea, they've clearly never had children. But the idea of blank slate is that your children come with no personality at all, and everything that they are is because of the environment. So, in other words, they are a blank slate that the environment writes upon, and the environment is what brings them or creates their personality, and there's nothing inherent in them as a baby. So if anybody has ever had a baby, held a brand newborn baby, or been around a very small infant, you know they are their own person. They have their own personality. It's very obvious that they are themselves, and they're not just the imprint of their most recent environment being, here they are on Earth. Anyway, so now we're pretty clear that it's a combination of both nature and nurture. I don't think there's really anyone who seriously can hold this idea that it's all nature or that it is all nurture, because both play an important role. So it's interesting to look at these different contributions, however, looking at the contribution of nature and looking at the contribution of nurture. So let's take a little bit of time first and look at the contribution of nature. And in that, what we're looking at are genetic influences. This stuff is so interesting. And it's all the way from just being like crazy fascinating when you're looking at wacky twin studies where both of the twins married a guy named Dave and they never knew each other, that sort of thing, to other maybe more serious, maybe less hilarious influences where you're looking at shared genetic influence on heart disease or shared genetic influence on emotion regulation, those sorts of things. And so to better show you some of this, I want you to listen to some videos that have I think if you were in class, I'd be showing them to you in class. So we're just going to go with this. I've got the videos here on screen, but better yet, you can go to the activity. The activity in Canvas lists all of the videos for this lecture. And so pause this, go to that activity, and look at the first two videos. They're kind of weirdly presented by Canvas. I don't understand why. There are two boxes for one video, but just go with it and click on the video and take a look first at the guys that are talking about twin studies. That's really kind of a fun video. And then secondly, you're going to look at Dr. Robert Plowman, and he is talking about genetic influences and twin studies. Super interesting stuff. So pause here, go to the activity on Canvas and watch those two videos, and then come back here. Okay, so you've watched the videos, you're looking at genetic influence. It doesn't mean the same thing as determinism. Determinism is this idea that you have no free will. You have no will, you have no choice in the matter of how you react. Everything in your life is based on your genes. And so, for example, you have no influence on your weight, you have no influence on the health of your heart, you have no influence on your immune system, no influence on your personality, etc. And we know that that's not true. There's no such thing as being determined by your genes. Everyone is pretty comfortable with the idea that you can do a lot to modify or to change or to create an environment that suppresses the influence of genes. So genes don't determine you. Instead, you interact with your environment, and genes are actually modified by those interactions that you have with the environment. And so we call this epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how the environment affects gene expression. Very, very interesting stuff. It's fairly new, epigenetics. And when we mentioned, I think in class some time ago, about how moms who go to McDonald's can actually create different genes for the children that they have later. And so how your behavior and your interaction with the environment, for example, going to McDonald's, can actually result in you passing different kinds of genes on down to your children. That's similar to the study of epigenetics. And so let's take a look at this video on epigenetics. Same thing, pause here, go to the activity, click on that video, watch that video, and then come back here. Okay, and so what you have seen is interesting stuff about the power that you have when interacting with your environment to create change. And so when you think, I can't help it, that's how my genes are, then you have to know that that's not accurate. There's lots that you can do when you interact with the environment that can create change in how those genes are expressed. Those genes might still be there, but they might not be expressed, right? So exercise, great diet, calm yourself, reduce the stress in your life through how you manage, how you deal with it. Those sorts of things, getting good sleep, those sorts of things can have a tremendous impact on your health and can help you create more than what you got, maybe create more than what you have to begin with. Okay. Next, so we looked at genes, and then kind of with this idea of it's coming with us. There are some personality theorists who had a lot of ideas about how our personality is inborn, but not in terms of personality traits per se, more in terms of our desires, our urges. And so we're looking really at Freud here. Freud talks a lot about this idea of innate urges, and his idea of what personality is based on the fact that we have these urges inside of us. And so he sort of just assumes, everyone has this urge, and how you deal with the urge is part of what creates your personality. And so Freud's personality theory is based on management of these urges. The urges are the love and death, are the kind of English loose translations, eros and thanatos. Or some people say sex and death. Some people say sex and aggression. It's more than just sex, and it's more than just death. And so eros and thanatos is a pretty good way of looking at it. So you have these urges, these inborn urges that you have to figure out, how do I control these things? What do I do with them? And so Freud has created that you have in you three kind of parts that help manage the urges. There's the id, there's the ego, and the superego. And so the id is the part of you that is pushing for whatever that urge wants. The id is like the 2-year-old that just, I want, I want, I want, I want. And there's no management of the wanting. You just want it. And so people think of it as that primitive or that primal urge. The superego, on the other hand, is like the mom or the parent or the person who says, no, you can't do that. So the superego is sort of like society, or it's sort of like the values that you're supposed to do, the shoulds. And so the superego tries to control the id urges. In between is the ego. And the ego is trying to navigate reality. And so the ego is like, okay, so the id wants me to do this, and the superego is like, should. And I'm just trying to figure out, how do I even make breakfast with all of this going on? Or how can I have a decent relationship when I'm trying to balance the id and balance the superego? And so the ego's job is to sort of navigate reality while you've got the influence of the id and the influence of the superego. Well, that's hard to do. And so the result of that is personality, because people vary in how well they do that and in the style in which they manage those urges. One of the ways that people manage their urges is they try and protect themselves with defense mechanisms. And so there are ways that you can handle these urges by either saying, no, they don't even exist. I'm in total denial. So that would be the denial defense mechanism. Or you can say, wow, the sublimation is the example I'm about to give. The sublimation would be something like, wow, I really can't stand this. I really have this urge to go be destructive. Let's say this is part of that aggressive or that thanatos urge. I just want to go beat up something or destroy something. So instead, I'm going to take all that energy and I'm going to sublimate it into creating art. And so they go in and they create this masterpiece on canvas, or they create this amazing drum solo or something. But the idea is that they took the energy that they would have spent on some sort of really aggressive behavior that the id wanted them to do, and instead they channeled that energy into something creative. And so that would be sublimation. That, of course, is seen as a more healthy kind of defense mechanism as opposed to straight up denial or straight up regression, where you're like, okay, I obviously can't handle this. I think I'm now going to become 4 years old. And so I'll just act like I'm 4, and people can say, okay, well, that's regression. All right, so there's a whole bunch of those defense mechanisms. There's a list of them in your book. There are lots of information online. You could do all kinds of interesting things looking at those. You could kind of keep an eye out for them in TV shows or movies that you watch, watching people, or, you could do it at the breakfast table maybe. How many people are doing denial and repression today based on, or regression? Repression is another one, based on this current COVID crisis that we're in. All right. After Freud, there were a bunch of people that had a varying amount of love or hatred for his ideas. And so there are some people that modified his ideas, or that took some of the basics and added some things onto them. We call them neo-Freudians, or we also more frequently call them psychodynamic practitioners or theorists. And so the psychodynamic theorists liked his idea of the ego, and they focused mostly on that, dropping out kind of the id and the superego ideas. One of the examples of psychodynamic theory is the theory of object relations, which I think is really fascinating. This is a theory promoted mostly by people who are called the British school, or the British neo-Freudians, or something like along those lines. These were people in Britain who followed Freud but modified his ideas. And so they're looking at this idea that your childhood has a tremendous influence on your personality. So again, this is the nurture end, not nature. the childhood, the way you were raised, the way your mother acted toward you, etc. This is fundamental to your personality. And so this kind of nurture is a little unbalanced in the ideas that you brought something with you, or there's things that are inherent in your personality that are structured more by genetics, DNA, that sort of a thing. This really takes a hard back seat to the idea of nurture. Now, object relations is looking at the fact that your personality now is a result of your relationships in the past. That's the basic kernel of object relations. You relate to other people kind of like they're still this primary object that you related to when you were young. So whatever you related to when you were young, that same style kind of gets transferred to people in the future, and that the way that you help and cure people or heal in your troubles is again through those relationships. And so you come to therapy who have a relationship with the therapist or the psychologist, psychiatrist, whatever, whoever's practicing this particular kind of psychodynamic therapy, and your relationship is the primary source of healing. And so as you have a relationship with a person who is very healthy, the ideal being that the therapist is healthier, then you can find ways to relate to them in a way that creates more health and modifies the ways that your personality was reacting to other people before that moment. So you're healing through your relations with others. That's object relations. That's an example of, heavy on the nurture side of how you explain personality. Personality is a result of interactions you've had, relationships you had in the past. Okay, so Freud, Neo-Freudians. There are lots of other ideas that you will find in your book. I'm not going to take the time to explain to you, but you can look in your book. There are ideas about humanism, person-centered therapy, by Carl Rogers in particular. Carl Rogers was really known for wanting a very collaborative view of therapy, where he believed that if you just offer the perfect environment of absolute acceptance and positive, unconditional positive regard, then the other person can find good healing in that. And so if they have the right environment, then they will bloom. That's the idea behind Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy, which is an outgrowth of humanism. Behavioral ideas being that the way you manipulate the environment can create behavior, and that the person's personality is really a series of their behaviors that are a consequence of how the environment was. So they're constantly reacting to the environment. That's sort of the idea. Social cognitive, things like social learning, Albert Bandura ideas about you learn from others. A lot of your personality is based on you observing, observation. So you read more about those in your books. They'll certainly be on the exam. Okay, one of the biggest ideas now in personality is this idea of the 5-factor model. The reason this is such a big deal is because it is so empirically founded. In other words, it is based on data, and a lot of data. And it's based on this idea of trait theory. Trait theory is that there are stable elements of personality that everyone has. And those stable elements might influence your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors. And so, for example, one of those stable elements that is probably most frequently thought of is this idea of being introverted or extroverted. If you're introverted, you tend to have particular stable elements of your personality that are perhaps more comfortable when you're not interacting with a lot of people. They are okay with you being alone. They're probably the kinds of things that make it so that during this COVID quarantine kind of thing, most people are in this style of not interacting with a lot of people outside of their house. You may interact online, but they're not in the room with you. And it may be that people who are introverted are more well adapted to this than people who have a high need for other people. But of course, these things operate on a continuum. And so this is one of the things to remember as we're looking at the 5-factor model. is this is a continuum. There's people with very little extroversion and a lot of introversion, all the way to people with a lot of extroversion and very little introversion. But nobody has 100% of either. Nobody is all extroversion or all introversion. It is always a continuum, and there's no truth at the extremes of that continuum. Most people are sort of in the middle. And I'm going to show you a little example, or have you take a little test that's an example that'll give you a sense of where you are on that continuum in terms of extroversion and introversion in a minute. So that's an example of a trait. And so factor analysis is this idea of using math to analyze where different groups of ideas land. And so what you're looking at is some ideas correlate with other ideas, and some ideas do not correlate with other ideas. And so if you say, well, I like being around people, that would probably correlate with I have a lot of friends. You can see where there's a relationship between those two. The person who likes being around a lot of people probably is also a person who considers that they have a lot of friends. So those two ideas go together. And so if you do the math and you look at a lot of ideas and you see which ideas sort of naturally fall together and which ideas don't work together, you end up with clumps of ideas. And the clumps are all the ideas that go together and they don't go with the other ideas, if that makes sense. And so that's one way of trying to understand what's happening when we do a factor analysis. And so the clumps are what we would call factors. Each one of those factors is independent. In other words, it doesn't correlate with the other factors. All the ideas in that factor correlate with themselves, but not with the other ideas that are in the other factors. And so what people have done is they've looked at all kinds of personality ideas or items on personality tests, for example, and they'll take tons and tons of these and they submit them to a factor analysis and see what shakes out. And so the factor analysis just mathematically looks at all the intercorrelations and figures out what the clumping pattern looks like. And what it turns out is that over and over and over, people have found that the same basic 5 factors seem to be coming out of these data. And so the conclusion is, it looks like people have about 5 basic factors that make up their personality. And so they looked at all the items that made up those personalities and tried to summarize them in a name. And so the names they came up with, you can remember with these 2 acronyms, ocean or canoe, the names are O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. And so you can read in your book, there's a good description of what all those things mean in your book. So I don't want to waste your time here by reviewing that same thing. Since you've already read it, right? Because every one of you have read the chapter already, right. And so ocean or canoe, you can remember that acronym to help you remember the names of those 5 factors. So when you look at the way the 5 factors explain people, there's a lot of compelling data out there. So in your activity, you'll take a quick 5-factor model personality test. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. I actually did my dissertation and my thesis, my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation in part on this model. And so what I was looking at is the NEO. The NEO is a short name for the neuroticism, extroversion, openness, right? Those 3 factor models. And so the NEO is the name of this test that these 2 guys, Costa and McRae, came up with. And then they revised it, and then it was called the NEO-PI, the NEO Personality Inventory Revised. So NEO-PIR. And it's been around for, 25 years at least. People have been looking at this test, using it for a variety of things. And so my interest in it for my thesis and dissertation was that Costa and McRae, who are the authors of the NEO, said that if you use this, people aren't going to lie. You can't fake this. They answer questions, and you can't fake it. You can't like make yourself look worse or better than you are, because these are just plain personality factors. And there's nothing like worse or better. So people won't lie on it. And so then, of course, people are skeptical of this. And I was one of those skeptical people. And I thought, I think people will lie. And so both of the thesis and dissertation was looking at, do people change their answers on these questions if they want to look good or look bad? And so for my dissertation, what I looked at were responses from people who wanted to become police officers. So my hypothesis was they're going to want to look better than they are. So they're going to answer some questions that make them look very much less neurotic, if they're neurotic, or more agreeable than maybe they actually are. So let's take a look and see if their answers seem to be unrealistic. And so what I did was I looked at the 5-factor test. We used the NEO-PIR, but I also looked at their MMPI scores. And so the MMPI is another objective test. We'll talk about that in a second. The MMPI is a test, paper pencil test, that has scales on it that will tell the examiner if the person was faking or not, if they're faking good or if they're faking bad. And so I correlated the scale. There's actually, let me back up for a second. There is a person who came up with a potential scale from the items in the NEO that would indicate if a person was faking good or faking bad. So someone created this scale out of the items that were existing already in the NEO. They said these items are vulnerable to people faking or not faking. Like, I like trees, that may not be vulnerable, but I'm a responsible person. That's pretty vulnerable. You know, if you want people to look good, you're going to say, yes, I'm a responsible person, even if you maybe are not, if that makes sense. And so I took the scale that this person had already created for the NEO. It was like an experimental scale. And I used the scale and I correlated that with these police officer candidates. Say they weren't police officers yet, they were applying. So I took their MMPI scores and I looked at their NEO scores, and those two scales, the lying scale on the NEO or the defensiveness scale, and then the NEO scale that was an experimental scale, to see if there was some relationship. And yes, there was. So what that meant was that people can fake the NEO-PIR, that Costa and McRae were mistaken when they said that people wouldn't do it, because across the board in these police candidates, they were doing it. And whether or not it was unconscious doesn't really matter a lot. The idea was that, yes, it was happening, that they were unrealistically showing how great they were, instead of, you know, looking at reality. The reality is that we're not all totally responsible all of the time. Okay, so that's the 5-factor model. Very, very interesting. You can see how it can help predict job performance. So for example, if you are more conscientious, then you're going to do a better job at any job, because you will be responsible, you'll be there on time, you'll do your work, you'll finish your work, that sort of thing. So of course, conscientiousness is valued in the job workplace. When you think about a marriage, you want some level of agreeableness. You want to be able to get along well. And so some level of agreeableness is important for creating and maintaining a good marriage. And across the board, there are a number of ways in which the 5-factor model can be very helpful to us. And so people use it a lot as they look at personality. How do people look at personality? Well, I just gave you some sense of how we use the MMPI and the NEO in terms of assessing people for jobs. That's one way you can look at it for jobs. You can look at it for marriage. Yeah. You can look at it for just your own general interest. Who am I? What am I about? What kind of person am I? There are a number of ways in therapy. What is going to help this person the most? What does this person need? Number of ways you can look at this. There are two basic categories of tests. One is projective tests, and the other one is objective tests. There are very much fewer projective tests than there are objective tests. Projective tests were more in vogue some time ago when psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theories about personality were more popular. And now it's really a lot about, we're assessing people for the purpose of what. So there's a lot more in terms of job assessment. There's a lot of people are interested in figuring out what makes a good executive, what makes a good worker, what kind of personality traits am I looking for success, what makes a good lawyer. And so let's give you a personality test to see if you'll succeed in law school. So a lot of personality tests are focused on, is this going to make this person successful in what area? That part is really, really growing. But basically, the two types, so those are objective tests. Sorry, those are objective. Projective tests look sort of more at your inner self, your inner thoughts, needs, worries, desires, that sort of a thing. And one of the reasons why they're not used as much is because they are harder to interpret. You need someone who is much more of an expert to interpret them, and they take a lot longer to interpret. And you really need to have an interview with the person in order to interpret them best. And so they're not cost effective, that is for sure. It's not necessarily that they are less accurate. It depends on the person who's giving them, whether or not they're accurate. So one example of a projective test that pretty much everyone has heard of is the Rorschach, the ink blot test. And it used to be that these ink blots were secrets. It used to be that they were controlled. They were controlled like the same way cocaine is a controlled substance. These cards used to be controlled. Now, pictures of them are everywhere on the internet. And the problem with that is that we wanted, as psychologists who do assessment, we wanted these cards to be new and different. We didn't want people to have previous experience with them. It's not that they're dangerous or that there's something hidden there, you know. It's that we just wanted something that was standardized, that all the psychologists who were doing the Rorschach assessment use, but that was brand new to everyone who looked at them. So they had no previous experience looking at them. So there are no prior ideas that were floating around. So they weren't contaminated, really, is a way to think of it, not contaminated. And now all of the cards, you just look up on Google and you can find all of the images for all of the cards. They're all there. So that kind of is out the window. So what people would do is they would look at the cards, and the person who's giving the Rorschach would say to them these words: what might this be? Those are the only words that you're allowed to say. I mean, that's not true. You can give other instruction, but you have to give those instructions. You don't say, what does this look like? So if you go to someone and they're like, we're going to give you a Rorschach, okay, what does this look like? Then you know they're not doing a good job. You can say, look, I want someone who actually knows what they're doing. Boom, you're out of here. What might this be? That's what you stick with. And so you tell the person what that might be. But it's not just about what you see. Sort of, it's like there are lots of other things that go into it. And so giving a Rorschach can take a long time. There are 10 cards, and you present each card to the person and you say, what might this be? And then you write down word for word every single thing they say, word for word. And so you learn how to write really fast and how to use a variety of shortcuts and this and that to get down exactly what they would say. You would often record it and then transcribe it, because exactly what they say is really critical. But you also know exactly you have to know how to score their test while you're giving it to them. Because if you don't know how to score it, you won't know what questions to ask them about what they saw in the cards. And that's really critical to how to score it. So giving a Rorschach requires a tremendous amount of training and experience, just a tremendous amount. It's hard to do. And so it's not cost effective. Lots of people don't do it. But when you get the right people who are very knowledgeable, who really know what to do, you get the right people doing it, they can produce some incredible results. So I knew the guy who ran my internship, my supervisor, during my psychology internship. He was a master at administering Rorschach. When I went to that internship, when I first showed up on their door, I thought the Rorschach was stupid. And that's what I had been trained to think in my graduate school. My graduate school basically taught that projectives are a waste of time, they're just silly and stupid, and they're unreliable. And that is true in the hands of people that don't know what they're doing. Untrained people, inexperienced people, yes, definitely true. But in the hands of people who are very well trained, very well experienced, who really know what they're doing, these instruments can be extraordinarily useful. And so I gained a tremendous amount of respect for the Rorschach while I was in my internship right after the end of my graduate school years. And seeing his results and seeing what he could pull out of a Rorschach about a person that he had never met. For example, I'll have a client, I'll give them a Rorschach, I bring the results to the supervisor. He's telling me these things about this client that are spot on. There's no way that he would know this other than through the test. So pretty impressive results. Uh, Another kind of test is an objective test. Objective tests are basically paper and pencil tests that the observer or the person giving the test is not going to really be able to influence much. With a projective, the person who's giving the test could say, okay, well, they said that they saw a bat, therefore they're bat crazy or whatever, and they could just have that idea that everyone who sees a bat is nuts. Well, that's not realistic or accurate. So the person giving the test has less influence in an objective test. An objective test is theoretically much more accurate and less biased. However, we do see that the circumstances in which people take the tests can influence their answers. Like I was saying before with the police candidates, you're taking the test and people are going to look at your results and decide if they'll accept you to be a cop. Well, you're going to answer differently than if you're just taking it for some other reason. Or let's say you're taking a test and you want to demonstrate to the court that you're insane. Well, your answers are probably going to be different than if you don't want to show that you're insane. Okay, so watch this video. This video is about assessment of personality. It's sort of an overall general video, give you a great background in assessment. So pause here, go to the activity and watch this video. Okay, we're going to take a look at the TAT, the thematic apperception test. This is an example of a projective test. Very, very interesting. And you're going to have a chance to do it. And so what happens is what we're looking at is the story that you make about an ambiguous picture. So what happens is you look at an ambiguous picture, you come up with a story about that picture. And then the person helping you or the person administering the test would help interpret your story about the picture. So let's give it a try. On the next slide, there's a picture. So you're going to look at the picture on the next slide. You'll come up with a story that includes these things. So first, what happened right before, what's going on in the picture, and then what's happening right now in the picture, and then what's going to happen in the future, immediate future. Excuse me, in the immediate future from this picture. And then there'll be a place in your activity to write down your story. Okay, so what happened right before the picture, what's happening now in the picture, what will happen in the future. So I'm going to move to the picture and then pause the video, take a look and write down your story. Give yourself a good 5 minutes at least to be able to do a good job of this. So you have enough material to really use in your activity. I'm also going to ask you to see if you can find a friend or relative or somebody to take a look at that picture and come up with their own story. And then you can look at similarities and differences in your interpretations or your stories about the picture. All right, so here's the picture. Write it down and then we'll move on. Okay, So when you're interpreting, you want to look at the themes that come out of your story. And so when when it's written down and you're looking at that, hopefully it's written down by now, right? It should be. You can look at what are the themes that you might see. And if you have trouble seeing themes, after you ask your friend or relative to also come up with their story, maybe the two of you can sit down together and kind of think about what themes do you see, what themes might be there. So some common themes are success or failure. You know, like the woman in the field has books, and so she's going off to college because she's going to save the family, she's going to be the success. That might be one theme. Or it could be, there could be lots of ways to interpret that. That's just one. There's no right or wrong way with the projective. You look at what are the themes. You're not interested in being right or wrong. There's no value there. The value is in looking at those themes. Okay, we talked about objective tests with the 5-factor model. Myers-Briggs is another objective test that's free. There are a lot of tests on the internet that are free that are terrible. The Myers-Briggs is one of the better ones. There's a free version of the 5-factor model that you're going to take in your activity. In my practice as a therapist, I use the PRF, which is the Personality Research Form by Jackson. I use that the most. I don't do assessment formally as part of my practice. There are lots of people that do formal assessment work, and I just don't. I focus on therapy, but I do use the PRF as part of therapy because it's a great jumping off point for a person understanding things about how they fit in terms of future jobs, or understanding about how each other is built in terms of doing marriage work. Most of the time I do it in the context of marriage. Next most would be in the context of I want some help in looking for what am I best suited for in terms of a job, or how am I doing at work? Why am I having trouble at work? Those sorts of things. And then, there are a lot of people, maybe not as many, but a lot that are just interested in who am I? What kind of things make up who I am? And then there's a fair amount of use that I get out of helping me tailor therapy better to that person, given their personality. And so the PRF looks at the needs you have as a person. Like, I really need a lot of change in my life, or I really need very, very little change in my life. I really hate a lot of change. So the person who really likes a lot of change doesn't mean that you're bad at it or good at it. If you don't like change, you could still be good at it. You just don't need it. It just doesn't motivate you. And so the person who really likes a lot of change might do a lot of changing their living room around, or repainting, or I decided to do, change my hair, whatever. Or their job suddenly is in Bali tomorrow, or they're doing all kinds of lateral moves, whatever. And so it looks at a number of about 30 different qualities, and it looks at how motivating is this for you? Is this something that really makes you want to get up in the morning, or is this something that just completely not useful in terms of motivating? Change is one of them. Achievement is one, your need for achievement. Do you wake up in the morning like, okay, I'm motivated by getting an achievement done? That's really does it for me. Or maybe you could care less, or couldn't care less, rather. All right, so that is the personality research form. MMPI is the most widely used, or maybe at least it was the most widely used personality test. It is very, very long, very, very standardized in the sense that there's a ton of research that tells you about it. So we know more about the MMPI than pretty much anything. It has been so widely researched. When I was in graduate school, some of the people in my school were experts on MMPI research, and that's pretty much what they did all day, was research on the MMPI. They made us take it in graduate school, so they knew the pain that we were putting other people through when we asked other people to take it, because this thing is 567 items long. That is super long. I mean, I like to take tests. I think it's fun to fill out little questions and answer them. But, it gets to be about like item 400, and even I, who likes this, I'm sick to death of it. And so 567 items. I'm glad they made us take it, because I certainly was careful about just, willy-nilly asking people to take it instead of really determining that this would be important and useful. So go ahead and suffer through 567 items. It takes a long time to take. Okay, that's it for this week. Next week, we will discuss social psychology. So again, to review, you have an activity, you have a quiz on the lecture here, and you have an exam this weekend on the last few chapters. I think it's 9, 10, and 11, and 12. And then I will see you next week for social psychology. Have a great week. Enjoy. And as always, feel free to email me with any questions that you might have.